Param, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
I'm so excited to be on here, Daniel.
Yeah, I know you've had a lot of professional success and a lot going on. We were just talking about our summers with kiddos and all the craziness with that as well. So you're a practicing radiologist. You've been doing that, what is it, 20 years now?
So it's 13 years since I've been out of training, and I worked full time for the first 10 years. And then the last 3 years, I've been a day a week or less in medicine at this point.
Gotcha. So yeah, still practicing 1 day a week as a radiologist. And your bigger professional endeavors here lately, you're getting into real estate. And I know you've built your own real estate portfolio, but have also started helping others with real estate and have built several businesses to kind of support all this. And that's pretty cool to see all that. And I imagine that there's a lot of balancing going on. I'm thinking like two kiddos, businesses, practicing medicine, life is a lot to kind of balance. But from my view, it looks like you're doing a great job with all that stuff. And I'm kind of excited to dig into how you've gotten to where you are today and how you've been able to. I know there's never this perfect balance, right? Or maybe you're this one person that I found that
Yeah,
has the
totally.
perfect balance, but I imagined.
The last person. No, you're absolutely right, Danielle. So it wasn't the plan, right? This wasn't the intended direction. When I got out of training, I got these amazing jobs as a radiologist. I'm a high income earner. It was the definition of success that I'd had for years, where I had the $1 million house, I had the 12 weeks vacation negotiated, and everything was going good. Traditional, how you anticipate things to be. And I realized along the way, before you have kids, it's very different. But as you have the first child and it's still manageable, and then you have the second child and you realize you definitely need way more time if you want to be intentional about being present for them. And that's when I think I started to realize that I had a lack of autonomy, didn't have absolute control over my time, right? So I definitely wanted to spend more time with the kids, but oftentimes they were spending the day with the nanny or in daycare. And so it was something I was getting used to. And I always say status quo is okay if it's not super painful. So it wasn't super painful. It wasn't to the point where a change needed to be made. And so I was just cruising along till there was a rough transition at work, where that's when I realized that things couldn't continue the way they were. And that's when I had to pivot. And pivoting for me was about accelerating my real estate journey. That's when I really understood the impact that would have. And then when I got to financial freedom, that's when I was able to cut back. So that's a little bit of the backstory in terms of how it worked out for me.
What were some of the reasons, like if we could go all the way back to, I don't know, like right before medical school? I guess that's kind of when you make that decision to go into the career, or maybe it was sooner for you, but like what were your main reasons? Maybe two-part question, like at what age did you decide you were going to go into medicine? And then at that point in time, like what were the reasons you decided to do that?
Well, so funnily, I'm Indian, and my parents knew when I was born that they wanted me to become a physician. So growing up, I just knew that I really early, like at 3, I
Yeah.
knew I was going to become a physician. So it's always been a part of my identity. And looking back, I mean, especially since I've cut back on medicine, a big part of my transition has been really being introspecting. There's nothing else I would rather have done, right? So as a career, as something that I spent so many years training to be, I just don't see myself doing anything other than medicine. It's just that the medicine was very different from the job that I had was more limiting. Medicine is very fulfilling. I still feel that way about it. I think the aspects of the job those were the things that I wanted to see the change in. But medicine per se, radiology, the diagnostic aspect, being procedural, I'm a breast imager, all of that was very, very fulfilling and satisfying. But the job was very different from how I wanted to practice medicine.
Yeah, I have heard that like a zillion times, unfortunately. This whole idea that most physicians I interact with seem to have got into medicine for the right reasons and have this vision of how they would ideally want to take care of patients and do healthcare. But there's that vision, and then you look at the actual reality of how they're doing it, and it's completely different. And that seems to have, I mean, it seems to be a big part of all this stress that exists with the profession. Because when you know the right way to do something and you're kind of like forced to do it a different way, that's like incredibly frustrating for some people. Some people have different tolerances for that. For me personally, like I have very, very low tolerance for that. I'm like, I got to get out immediately because it's extremely frustrating. But has that been your experience? Is that like,
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Daniel. So there are a few components to it, right? Burnout is definitely a huge component. And burnout can be because the workload, what you're expected to, your expectations at work, there's a mismatch over there, right? That's not what you want to do. That's not what you have capacity to do. And those expectations aren't resetting. Burnout could be because, and I've seen this with physician friends who are sometimes commuting 4 hours a day to get to a job that they like, but then it's taking away so much from quality of work. I remember during the pandemic, right after that rough career transition, where it was a 6-month period, I didn't have autonomy. I realized that if I didn't get back into another job, I wasn't financially secure at that point. So you have all of that transition. But right after that, when I got settled in and I had another job lined up and I was settling in there, the pandemic happened. And a lot of physicians experienced burnout during the pandemic because suddenly, workload shifted. The way we were practicing medicine had to shift and pivot. And all physicians listening to this will understand it was a time of huge transition. I went through that transition, and fortunately enough, as a radiologist, and I think many of us were able to work part-time from home, but being at home with the kids being at home, and then suddenly, shifting in terms of what your workload used to be and what you're expected to read, and a shift in that workload also, all of those things actually contributed to burnout for me. I remember there were days where I wanted the next day to be better, so I would stay up late at night after the kids went to bed to catch up on additional cases so that I would ensure that the next day was better. But in the process, I was burning out, right? There's so many reasons why how your job in medicine actually contributes to burnout. And then there are two aspects to that. A lot of that is also your ability to set boundaries and to adapt to the situation. The big part of it, like you said, if you're not the kind of person, and so many of us are in situations where we aren't thriving in medicine, the ability to make a shift, right? That ability, the shift could just be staying there, really defining your boundaries, negotiating better. But if you want to get into a better situation, a lot of physicians aren't in a position where they're able to make that shift. And that's where I think financial freedom comes in. That's where whatever you're doing, right? Everything that you talk about, financial planning, all of that contributes to your ability to make that pivot if you need to.
Yeah, we always say using finance or your money as a tool is the key. Like, it's not the money in itself. Like, money doesn't act like having $1 million or $1 billion or whatever. That does nothing in itself. Like,
yes,
it's how you use it is the question mark as a tool. I'm curious about some of the big decisions along the way, like maybe before you shifted out, like starting in practice, selecting a practice, selecting a specialty even, like before you were kind of into real estate, maybe how did finances play into some of these big career decisions, or did they?
To some extent, they did. I wouldn't say finances per se. I would say more lifestyle, because I did decide to go into radiology, which is one of the lifestyle subspecialties in medicine. I did decide to pick breast imaging, which again is a better lifestyle choice because oftentimes you have the ability to say, I don't want to do weekends. I don't want to work overnight. So you do have that ability. I think that was an intentional choice. It's also something that I was really good at, and that helped. But I think looking back, having that time for my family and being able to balance it, like you said, how do you balance it? How are you supposed to balance it if you're one person and you are full-time in multiple things, right? So it's not possible. And so if you don't have that freedom of time, then everything else falls apart. So I think I've been very intentional from the beginning about the choices I made. But even with those choices, I realized that I wasn't really where I needed to be. And, people ask me all the time, how did you pivot from medicine to real estate? I don't think that's what happened. And I think this is the core of what you speak to also. Daniel, when you're making money, as a physician, as any kind of professional, anyone who's making money, you need to be investing it, because if you aren't investing it, then you're constantly trading your time for money, but you want your money to be making money for you. And for me, real estate was just that vehicle. It was just a vehicle I chose to really make my money work harder for me, essentially. That's essentially it. And the rest of it was just a passion project. It started off as, okay, I want to talk about this because you know this, Daniel, I've listened to your podcast and the topics you pick, right? These are such important topics. A lot of us struggle with this, but there's never a space to talk about it. No one's really at the workplace. You're not talking about it. You interact with friends. Oftentimes people are very tight-lipped about finances, but all of our struggles are so similar. When I got to the point, I realized that, well, I could have done this 10 years ago if someone had walked me through this whole process. And so it was just a question of talking to people about, hey, what are you doing with your money? How are you investing it? Because if we're not intentional about it, we're going to land up somewhere where we don't want to be.
Do you think financial literacy was a big part of it?
So I don't think there's ever a focus on financial literacy, right? So right now, listening to your podcast, there are so many people talking about it. I think 2010, when I came out of fellowship, I think it was a different world back there. I don't think there were so many people talking about all of this. I don't think it was part of our curriculum in school. It's not something we talked about as a family, especially if you're a physician. The understanding is that your income in medicine is your financial security, which is completely not true because that job is not in your control, and therefore that income is not in your control. and you're trading your time for money, right? If you don't put the time in, you're not getting the money. So financial literacy is important, but there really isn't a focus on it in school, in families, in our circles. And so I had mentors who taught me what they knew, which kind of got me started. So 2014, I got my first rental. I got a couple of rentals along the way, but I didn't really know what I was doing with them entirely, right? I was somewhat financial literate and people taught me what they knew, but there was so much more to learn. And as soon as I learned that, I was able to pivot. So financial literacy is absolutely imperative, I mean, for anyone, right? But there aren't really conversations about it. And I would say 15 years ago, the resources weren't there. I think it's easier now if you want to go in and read blogs and understand. But that's where having someone assist you with the planning, or maybe I think mentoring and coaching in that space is so helpful, because just listening to things here and there, it's kind of hard to have a systemized roadmap, right? So if you have someone who can actually look at things holistically and help you build that roadmap, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I know you're probably you've experienced it on both ends. You were saying like you had a mentor, and I imagine, we haven't talked about this yet, but I imagine you've kind of experienced it on the other end of being the mentor or helping someone kind of learn or make a plan or whatever. I've experienced that working with families. It's like the light bulb goes off, or it's like connecting financial literacy to like your ability to enjoy time with family, or like, there's a lot of different ways this kind of plays out. But like one thing I have noticed is similarity to a lot of these people like you that have had success here is that there's some component of another person that helped them kind of like get over the hurdle. In other words, it's really difficult or maybe impossible to go at it alone.
I think so, Daniel. I mean, I remember one of my colleagues at my first job out of fellowship. He was a third generation real estate investor, and he kind of got me started. He connected me to his team. He told me how to invest in the stock market. He told me what to do with real estate. And I think if he hadn't really guided me, and I would teach him Brestamar, which was something he was learning on the go. He hadn't actually trained to do it. And so he taught me how to invest in the stock market and real estate. And I don't think I'd be here if I hadn't had the perspective shift that I had because of interacting with him, right? And so that's what oftentimes, and you understand this, right? What we're doing is we're just presenting people with multiple different options. So they have different perspectives to pick from. So, and they're more intentional about what matters to them. And it's not a one size fits all, but really being able to see what your options are is really important. And I think having someone who kind of shifted that perspective for me and got me started, if I hadn't seen the impact that $150,000 property had over 6 years, I would never have taken the step to really accelerate when I did, right? And so I think it's really important at having those people at the right time. The earlier, the better, because then you have the compounding effect of time.
Yeah. And so you originally started out, you were doing the real estate while also practicing medicine full time, right?
So I was. And so funnily, and I say this all the time, it's like when I didn't have kids and I had all the income and I had all the time in the world and I was in academic medicine, I didn't realize the impact of real estate investing, right? So I bought my first rental property. It was putting $500 in my pocket every month. And I thought, well, how is this ever going to get me to $10,000, $20,000, right? So I was like, okay, well, this doesn't make sense. I put it on the back burner and then I purchased something without leverage. So again, doing things, not really doing them the right way, I would say, looking back. But I at least got started.
Was your first turnkey like a outsourced, like you had a manager and the whole thing?
Yeah, exactly. And so my mentor would invest out of state with a property manager who never laid eyes on his properties. And so that gave me the perspective that I could do that. And I was living in California. I wasn't sure if we were going to settle down here. So I started investing in Texas, right? And I didn't have any barriers around that because I saw him do that successfully. But I would say even then, I didn't realize the impact. But then looking back in 2019, like I said, status quo is fine. As long as everything, you're sailing, it's okay. But when I had that crash, that's when I looked around and I was like, okay, so what's my stock portfolio looking like? What does real estate look like? And then I saw that with a third of my money in real estate, I was getting twice as much in passive income, because at that point I was thinking, what about passive income, right? So what if I don't go to work tomorrow? What happens to my family? And that was like the light bulb moment for me. Like, so 6 times the passive income. Why is that? And then that's when I learned about the 4% safe withdrawal rate. And I was like, wow, I need to have 2.5 million in my retirement accounts if I want to pull out $100,000. With real estate, it was like, a fraction of that invested in real estate, even doing what I was doing, which was just buying them turnkey, keeping them super passive and having someone manage it. I could get to that point so much faster. But then along the way, I learned so many other strategies, for high income professionals, we're paying multiple 6 figures in taxes. There are ways that, depending on what you invest in, right? Short-term rentals, you may be able to, some of our members shelter $500,000 of income from taxes just by virtue of investing in short-term rentals. So many different ways to do it. That's when I accelerated. But yes, when I was doing that, I was still working full time. And that was during the pandemic, right? So the kids were home, I'm working full time. And I was still able to get to financial freedom within a year. My plan was a 3-year plan. I got it within a year just because of getting more literate in terms of, okay, what is this and what can I do and how can I accelerate? So I say I did it when I was working full time and I had 2 kids during the pandemic. I didn't really do it when I had all the time in the world and, didn't have kids. So a lot of that has to do with the fact that, when your mindset shifts, that's when you're able to do it. When you have those different perspectives, when you have the knowledge in terms of what you can do with it.
Mm-hmm. I imagine with all that going on, that was tough to balance. I mean, everybody's busy and there's never any spare time, but that sounds like a lot.
It does. And it's funny because I had a friend, and this was a time I was acquiring 3 properties and I was rehabbing a property without a general contractor. And so she calls me and goes, I don't know, maybe you should slow down. And I was like, wait, but it isn't that bad, because the 3 properties I was acquiring, my systems were down pat where, I was acquiring them out of state, and it would take me 2 hours tops from when I tell my agent I need to acquire something to when the notary comes home and has me sign all the, they actually come home and have me sign all the paperwork. So 2 hours per property over the course of the acquisition. So it really wasn't as much work. And then the rehab was something I was doing because I wanted to get the tax savings at that point, right? So I wanted to be a little more active because I wanted to, again, it was about my goal, which was to get to the point of financial freedom faster. And I wanted to do it when my kids were little, not like 10 years later. And so I was hustling a little bit at that point, but even then I was probably spending 1 to 2 hours a day on real estate, which isn't a lot considering the fact that if I wasn't doing that, I was probably watching 2 hours of Netflix. And so it was a choice. It was like prioritizing what I wanted to do. But I say this, Daniel, and again, it's not one size fits all. So it's going to be, I think of real estate investors as 3 different categories, right? When people try to think about it and they're like, well, I don't know if I can do this. You could be what I call the investor or the legacy builder who's doing it slowly, right? Slow and steady, buying 2 rentals, turnkey, getting a property manager to manage it. Would probably take you 10 years to get to financial freedom. You could do what I did, and I call that the short-term hustler, where you're doing midterm rentals or you're doing rehabs and you're hustling for a short 2 to 3 year period, but you're getting to financial freedom that much faster. Or you could be what I call the entrepreneur who thrives in this environment, who really likes setting up spaces and running short-term rentals, or syndicating apartment complexes and being a general partner. And they like that. They like the business of real estate and they want to do it. And so you could be anywhere along the spectrum. The entrepreneur obviously gets all the tax breaks and they accelerate much faster. The short-term hustler does it for a while and then they just set it, and it just that's what my current rental portfolio, I spend 15 minutes a month on it and it's just generating passive income. Or you could be someone who stays super passive from the beginning, and that's what you're trading, right? It's a trade-off between time and returns essentially, and there's a spectrum and you get to pick where you want to be on it.
Do you think if medicine had played out exactly how you'd envisioned on the front end, like if it had been not a messed up healthcare system, or you had been able to practice medicine how you'd hope, or if there wasn't, and maybe on top of that, if the pandemic hadn't happened, and if all these big things that were kind of like stress points within the traditional track in medicine hadn't happened, do you think that you would have still gone into real estate, or do you think how would it have played out in your mind? Do you think it would have been different, or do you think you would have still ended up where you are?
So if I knew what I know today, I would have still done the real estate on the side, right? I don't know if I would have grown the community and done all the education part of it. I think that came from a place of pain where I saw that, there was a need for people to talk about it and the need for people to be more, physicians to be more financially literate. I think that came from a place of pain. But if knowing what I know today, I would totally have started investing. Like I said, you're always investing, right? Even if you're putting your money on the mattress, that's just your choice in terms of what you want to do with your money, right? So you always are placing it somewhere. You're placing it in a CD, you're investing it in traditional retirement account, you're investing in real estate. Real estate is it's definitely higher risk adjusted return. So when you know what you're doing, you're significantly lowering your risk and you're significantly increasing your return. So I don't see a world where I wouldn't be investing in real estate. I probably would not have started the community. I don't think the healthcare system is messed up as such. I think what happened is that my needs transitioned, right? When I was single, I could spend 10 hours a day in medicine and that was perfectly fine 5 days a week. I think as the family started growing, I wanted to make different choices, and understandably, there wasn't a place for it in medicine. I wanted to go down to 3 days a week. I tried the compressed schedule thing where I was working 10 hours a day, 4 days a week, and I started burning out. It just wasn't sustainable. Although on paper, it seems like it's better. I think it was just, your life situations change. Where you are now, you may be in a different place 5 years from now. having that flexibility is super important. Not being able to tailor your lifestyle based on your needs at any specific moment, that can be very frustrating. And I think that's where having financial freedom and decoupling your income from your job, I've spoken to many physicians who've cut back intentionally, because they've gone through the program, they've now have a portfolio and they can do it, they have passive income, but also just because they had to. It's always hard to transition and to cut back in medicine. But I think having the choice becomes so important. So I would have loved to practice maybe 2 days a week in medicine at most, if that was an option. It wasn't really an option for me to go to 2, so I went down to a day a week in medicine. But I think it's always about, it's always a transition, and having the flexibility to do things at any given time. I think that's important. That's what financial freedom gives you.
So you're down to 1 day a week, and you're also financially independent now. And I mean, that nice thing about that is you got all kinds of flexibility, and you could go all sorts of different directions. And as long as you're willing to use your money as the tool, which you're doing a good job of, and that's really good to see. I'm curious about the scaling back part in medicine, and I'm wondering if you felt any like guilt or shame or pressure from other people about like scaling back. Did any of that happen, or was it pretty seamless transition for you?
I think the identity part is hard for all of us. And it sometimes seems like it's the people around us, but oftentimes that's just the part within us, the guilt within us, that is hard to deal with. I've learned to realize that every time I feel something because someone said something, it's because I have that doubt within myself. It's hard, but I think what I've come to realize is that I will always be a physician at heart. That medicine, you always take it with you. I always constantly get consults. I'm constantly assisting and helping people and giving advice as a physician. I mean, I haven't cut back completely. And I think a big part of that is because it's hard to let go of that identity. But I do know other people in the space who have grown their portfolios where they're cutting back, only because oftentimes it's because, they want to work a few days a month, and that's not always an option, right? The way organizations work, it may not always be the right fit. And so it's a choice between working full time and not being in medicine. And many people choose to not be in medicine at that stage in life. But I think it's always a hard transition, but oftentimes it's us being hard on ourselves more than anything else.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of real estate, and obviously you're a good example of how real estate can work out really well. I mean, you can look at a lot of like the wealthy people in the world, and most of them have been investors in real estate. And so I think it's pretty safe to say, like, generally speaking, real estate's a great place to invest in. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And maybe we can get into some of those options here in a second, but I'm curious about like the balance of things. So like real estate's great. And I think that's a pretty safe statement, generally speaking. Healthcare is a little bit of I said it's a train wreck. I mean, it's not, there's some problems in healthcare. And I think that there's a lot of burnout and stress, and a lot of physicians are looking for alternatives. And so I see a lot of physicians naturally, for good reason, turning to real estate as a solid solution to kind of give them some freedom from the stressors that come with practicing medicine. And I like that. I mean, that's partly why we were talking before we started recording. That's partly why we're talking and we've started kind of getting into real estate, is because it can be a great solution to help make this shift. But one of the concerns I have, this is probably more as like a patient side of things, or maybe just more of like a big picture for the country sort of thing. Like I see a ton of physicians getting out of medicine earlier than maybe they had expected to do things like real estate or side gigs, or, just retiring early. And as a patient, I'm like, oh no, I am concerned about my future or my kids' future of like being able to get quality healthcare. But being where you've gone in your life, I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this idea.
So I think it's always a demand supply question, right, Daniel? So I feel like if we get to the point where there is actually a shortage, then the terms, the ability to negotiate, the number of hours you work and the number of patients you see, all of that's probably going to transition also. I think the equilibrium will always be there, where physicians will have the option to practice medicine in a safe way and also provide care. So if we ever get to the point where more people are doing that, then, and we actually have a mismatch in demand supply, I have a feeling we'll reach an equilibrium where physicians will be able to negotiate better terms. So I don't see that as the direction. I mean, even within our community, I cut down to a day a week, and that's because my kids were 3 and 5 when I got a financial freedom. And I just wanted, like, the last 2 years I've spent so much time with them. I'll never get that back. They start school in August. So I was at a different stage in my life. I know multiple physicians within our program who have cut back, and all they want to do is go down to 3 days days a week, right? 3 days a week will just be, that's the balance that they need. And so that, I think that's a healthy balance for someone who's worked in medicine for 20 years, who wants to go down to 3 days a week. I think that that's a very healthy balance for people. There are people who love medicine, love the way they're practicing it, and they just want the passive income. So there's no pressure. So they're able to go in and negotiate better terms for themselves. And so I think there are people on different ends of the spectrum. And again, I feel like if you ever get to the point where there is an acute shortage, then we'll be able to negotiate better terms. So I think that equilibrium will be reset. We're just not, like you said, we're just not at that point right now where I know primary care physicians who have a 15-minute slot to see a patient before they have the next patient after 15 minutes. They're not doing justice to patients the way that is. And I can see it. They're burnt out every day. That needs to shift. And this is just giving the healthcare providers more control so that they can negotiate better terms for themselves, is how I see this going. My case is different because for me, I was at the point where, that was just a change I needed to make per se in that stage of my life.
Right.
But people who have older kids and people who, everyone has different needs. And I think this just gives people options, right? Where we aren't handcuffed, right? So it's not the golden handcuff scenario, essentially.
Right. And that's the worst, because if you're like, I think of like the early career, like let's say you're just getting out of training, you're starting your practice, and you go to a hospital and you're like, you go to meet with them first time, they introduce you to the realtor, they show you in the nice neighborhood, you buy the $2 million house, and then you sign the 5-year contract that's locked in with the non-competes and the big bonus that you got to pay back if you leave early, and you get the private schools, and then, there's tail coverage you got to pay for if you leave. And and then the RVU thing kicks in after a couple of years, and you realize, oh no, I got to actually like work harder than I had initially realized on the front end because I had the guarantee and it's gone away. And all those things kind of like build, and they're not in your favor, and they lock you down hard, aka the golden handcuffs. And like you mentioned, and that's the opposite of freedom, and that's not a good spot to be in. But the more physicians are able to negotiate or get better terms, like on those sorts of things, or even just have financial freedom. Like when you have financial freedom, you could be like, no, I'm not doing that.
You can put your foot down and say that this is what is best, in my opinion, is best for the patient. This is what I'm willing to do. And it gives you the ability to do that because, a lot of physicians are frustrated by their jobs, but they're doing it not because they want to go in every day. It's because they have to. And it's just about shifting that from where they get to go in and they want to go in, and they're not doing it because they have to.
Right. So you started out doing turnkey, like kind of hiring a manager, direct ownership, right? So you bought a property. We've had some people on to talk about turnkey investing. It's kind of like pretty passive. Like you still have to select the company to like manage the whole deal for you, but it's pretty much, not a whole lot of work, right? You just select the property and they kind of do the whole deal, and it's but there is a cost that comes with that, right?
Yeah, there's the education part. So like even within the, like I said, I like to classify them as 3 different categories, right? So the investor is the person we're talking about who's like, wants to be very, very passive, doesn't want too much time in it. And they can choose to invest passively in apartment syndications where they just have to vet the sponsor, find someone they like working with and work with them, or they can buy their own turnkey rentals, right? Both of those are passive. I would say there's a little bit of trade-off over there. When you're direct ownership, you have slightly higher returns, but you need to be somewhat educated, right? You have to pick the right market, you have to pick the right team, you kind of have to run your numbers. And we have tons of free calculators, and there are other people who have those free calculators, but there's a little bit of education that goes into it. So you don't want to just jump in and buy something and then find out, I can't evict someone because it's I'm in a tenant friendly state, or the numbers don't make sense and I'm pouring money into this, $1,000 goes in. That's not the situation you want to be in. So there's a little bit of upfront education. But if you get that right, then you could get to the point where, like I said, it's like 15 minutes a month is what you're spending on your portfolio, because it's you're not going in doing rehabs. It's like turnkey, simple, someone else is managing it. So you can build those systems. And that's where I think the whole point of me starting to talk about it was for people to see that even direct ownership can be super passive, right? That's an option. And then you have the ability like to be like a hustler. Like that's what I did. I started off super passive. Then I moved into, I'm going to do rehabs and increase the value of these properties, increase the rents, take all of that money, do a refinance, and then buy something else. I'm going to do all of that, but I'm only doing it for a year or two. And then it's very fluid. I get to go back to that passive state and just let it ride out and have property managers manage it. And I think it's important for people to see that you have options and you always have the ability. And, the reason I went into that mode was because I wanted the tax savings, right? I wanted to really accelerate my growth by getting those tax savings and sheltering my clinical income from taxes so I could use that to grow the portfolio faster and get to financial freedom faster. But then right after I hit that point, I don't do rehabs anymore in my personal portfolio. We do that with the apartment syndications. That's a different thing. With my personal portfolio right now, I like to just buy turnkey, went back to the same strategy, turnkey, Class A properties, nice tenants, properties that make sense in landlord friendly states, right? So you get to pivot at any point and you can keep it super passive, I think, are the takeaways over there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think either way though, you gotta get some baseline education, and a lot of the resources you're providing, they're solid for those sorts of like educating yourself on a baseline. Especially, I mean, if you're gonna go the passive route, like we're saying with turnkey, for example, or going into syndication or something, you still have to have some level of education. I've definitely encountered a lot of people that think that they don't need any education, so that's a misconception.
Dangerous.
It's dangerous.
Yeah, it's dangerous. That's why I started talking about it, because I see friends all the time making mistakes. And I'm like, we'll talk about it. And you only present options to people. And you'll be like, well, yes, the sponsor doesn't have they don't have a track record. So I would really be careful about that. And then you see them after 6 months, they've invested $500,000 and they're coming, pulling their hair out saying, I need to get my money out because the partnership is fracturing. So, okay, well, that's the due diligence part, right? So you need to do that up front. So even if you're a passive investor in direct ownership or syndications, that initial due diligence, I think, needs to be done to some extent. And it's hard for people to know what they should be looking at. Okay, what do I look at in the market? What do I look at in my team? What do I look for in the property? And so I think that's where we do a lot of free education. We have free live events every year where all we talk about is, okay, this is the due diligence you need to do, your free ebooks, but it's like putting everything together in one place where they go in knowing something, so they're making the right choices.
Right. Yeah. And if you're listening, if you work with us already, like one-on-one, we can kind of help with some of the like higher level, especially at a minimum, like having a second set of eyes on things. At a minimum, I think that's one of the biggest things is if you can just be running your ideas through some other lens or doing some checks on them to kind of get some additional input, that's a huge deal, and it'll save you lots of headaches and gets you kind of to that baseline. But then from there, you got into a little bit more active investing where that starts to take more time, but you typically see a lot better returns, or you should see a lot better returns when you get your hands dirty and get more involved. The trade-off is you got to spend a lot more time, but it's a much faster way to grow your portfolio, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, Daniel, when you're growing up and you hear about money, people just say, okay, you want to get to financial freedom sooner, work harder and earn more and spend less and all of those things. And all of those things are important, but there's only so much more you can work, right? Especially when you have 2 kids, you realize, okay, wait, I don't know if this is going to work anymore. But the thing that people don't talk about is like, what is the return, the ROI of your overall portfolio? Like no one talks about that when they talk about financial freedom, because all you hear is the 4% safe withdrawal, so the 25x, your annual requirement, that's where your portfolio needs to be. All of that is built for the stock market, and that's based on that 4% safe withdrawal. You can only withdraw 4% from that stock portfolio in retirement. The funny thing is that we actually have a retirement calculator on the website, and there are so many other retirement calculators where you can actually plug in the numbers. And if you go from that 4%, when I plug my numbers in, it would take me 17 years to get to financial freedom investing in the stock market. But with real estate, the passive real estate that we talked about, right, those passive strategies, you get 20% annualized returns every year. Right? That's with a lower risk profile. And I mean, we can get into that if we need to. But when you get active, right? When you spend more time on real estate and you get active and you start tapping into those advanced tax strategies, we can get up to 200% ROI in year one. And so it's a game of returns, essentially. When you plug those numbers in, and so even if you're conservative and say you get to a point where you're getting 70% ROI because you're doing a short-term rental, you're getting the tax savings, you can get to financial freedom in 2 to 3 years as opposed to 17 years. So I like to look at it as a game of returns. Right? There's a spectrum. It's time versus returns, and it's also risk versus returns. And I pick where you want to be, but real estate is definitely significantly higher. So you can go all the way up to 70% ROI over your portfolio once you're factoring in cash flow, tax savings, and equity increase over time. And that's what I kind of want people to understand. So when you change those numbers based on the ROI of your portfolio increasing, once you add real estate in there, that's when you're really accelerating to financial freedom. And so there's even an ebook on our page. It's a free ebook you can download where I talk about, the first property, it took me 6 years to get to the point where I pulled all my cash out. The second property, I pulled all my money out of that deal in 6 months. And that's the game of returns, right? So when you're able to do that, that's what's really accelerating you, which is why I think it's
from
amazing.
leveraging.
From leveraging, from equity increase, from the tax savings, from forcing appreciation, all of those things, you can actually bump those returns up significantly. But that requires more education, and then it does require more time on your part.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, at a minimum, I think you got to understand, especially if the more active you're going to be in it, you got to understand all these concepts, like for sure, like at least.
Otherwise, you're learning from your own mistakes, right? Like you said,
Yeah,
Daniel,
you don't want to do that.
When you have someone reviewing that and giving you a different perspective, then you're learning from them as opposed to learning from costly mistakes that you're making yourself.
Right. And they can be huge, massive, especially when you talk about leverage. Like when you talk about leverage, there's the downside risk is a lot bigger. And, you don't want to make a mistake with being over leveraged.
Especially
in this sort of
with
situation.
commercial loans. I think commercial loans are a whole different beast, where leverage is like, be very intentional about how much leverage you have on those properties. With conventional loans, they're more forgiving, but you still don't want to have, if you're trying to get to financial freedom, and I see people all the time getting something with an investment property with a 15-year loan in a high cost of living market like the Bay Area or LA, and they're pouring $5,000 into that property every month. Now that's a different kind of handcuff, where you're handcuffed to your job because you need to keep feeding the property in the hope that 15 years later you get to a point where it's giving you returns. But yeah, so really being intentional about what you're doing, I think is key. Understanding what your overall goals are, and then picking from that spectrum. So I'm just like trying to show that there's a whole spectrum in terms of effort, risk, and reward, and you get to pick, and you get to pivot at any point, and it's very fluid. But that's where kind of educating yourself and having a mentor or having someone who can guide you becomes really helpful.
Right. I think, there's a lot of different ways to make money in real estate, but you got to start to understand all those options for starters to even know which direction you might want to go. And then you got to start to learn from someone and then experience it yourself. That's where you really, once you kind of mix all those together and you start experiencing it, there's a lot of people I know and come across that own like one property. There's a whole bunch of people that own like one property. And part of that was because so many people got their first property in like 2008 or 9. That's when real estate tanked. In fact, I was a real estate investor after 2008 because my age group and older, we were buying like our first house in like 2007 and the real estate market tanked. And so you got a ton of people, like say you bought a house in Florida, real estate cut in half, and then you're like, I can't get rid of this thing. It's lost half its value. And so they became overnight, real estate investors, and they have one property. That's not the ideal way to get into real estate. There's no intention behind that. It's kind of just like a solution to the problem that you're in. And typically those types, including myself, didn't have like a ton of like knowledge yet around how to do it. But I've noticed even still today, there's a whole bunch of people that just have like either have owned one or maybe two at the most properties, and they have a hard time getting over that hump. But I think a lot of it has to do with just not getting these baseline things that we're talking about covered, like
exactly
doing the numbers, the basics, or not educating themselves, not having a team of people around them.
I think that's the most important thing, Daniel. I like to call them accidental landlords, because either it's because they purchased a home and moved out of it and they started renting one, or they're someone who saw home prices appreciating so quickly between 04 and 05, and then they did it for appreciation, but they purchased properties that weren't cash flowing day one. And so a big part of what you want to do is find something that's cash flowing day one, because here's the thing, property prices tanked after 08, 09, but let's look at what happened to rents nationally, right? Historic numbers for rents in that period. 08, rents dropped by 4% nationally. 09, they dropped by another 5%, and then they started shooting back up. So if you had a cash flowing property where you had that 10% buffer built in, that's why we stress test properties. That's why we use calculators. That's why we have those resources available for free. But if you've done that and you've stress tested your properties and you have that 10% buffer, you would not have had to feed that property from day one. It would have just sat there, rents went up. And then here's the interesting thing about inflation hedge, right? Your rents are going up, but your mortgage payment is fixed at that level, whatever you got it at. And so over time, your cash flow is increasing. So if you got something at 08 before the crash and that property was cash flowing and you were able to hold it with a 30-year mortgage, you would be doing phenomenally well today, right? And then the problem is people didn't have cash flowing assets because they were banking on appreciation. And that's a mistake you don't want to make. I know a physician who bought 64 units, these apartment buildings in 07 and 08, but he got the right kind of debt on them. Now, again, commercial loans, that's a whole another beast, but he had the right kind, he had seller financing, so he could just hold it, right? And he did phenomenally well, even even though prices tanked, because he had the right debt on it, which you don't have to worry on it if you have conventional mortgages with the single family home. And he had a property that was cash flowing, right?
Right.
So that's the only thing. And then you have inflation help you, and then time help you.
And long term, like, a lot of these direct ownership, like long-term rentals, for instance, you should ideally view it as a long-term thing. So like you should be prepared for the market to tank unexpectedly.
Yes.
You never know. And that should be like kind of just a thing that happens, that's just a blip on the radar. But like it doesn't matter that much 20 years from now. You're still gonna do the thing, and it's just gonna, and if you're doing it for cash flow reasons too, like you said, like that typically doesn't have as massive of effect, or it should already have been built into the equation that it should be a
Exactly.
non-issue.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think historically home prices go up by 3 to 4%, and that's just inflation matched. And if you factor that drop in, and you still see where we are, we're actually home prices are increasing above that inflation baseline, right? And
Yeah,
so,
lately.
yeah, as long as you have a long-term strategy, as long as you're buying in the right markets, and so every real estate is very hyper local, every market performs well. This is where market due diligence comes into play, right? If you're buying something in a landlord-friendly state where there's tons of population growth, industry diversification, where people are migrating and their incomes are going up, then you're safe, right? Because then you have the ability to
Market.
exit that deal.
Right. Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff with real estate we can get into. I wanted to touch on a couple different things. I know we're running out of time, and there's about actually more like 15 things I was hoping to get into, but there's two things hopefully we have time to get into that I was hoping to ask you about. The first thing was kind of thinking about the current situation with real estate in the future. It's a little bit of a unique market in some regards, like interest rates have gone up a fair amount,
Yeah.
and then prices have gone up as well, especially in some of these desirable areas. And so it's made some of these calculators, like if I'm running the typical calculator on a rental property,
Yeah.
it's become a lot harder to make my calculator work
Yes.
lately. Especially I feel like as an investor wanting to get into it, it's become almost like a hurdle for me if I was already a little gun shy, and I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
So I'm curious of your thoughts on that. And then the second thing I wanted to make sure and hit on is, how do people find you? I wanted to talk about your community and kind of make sure we get this in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me get into the first thing. So everything you talked about is 100% correct, Daniel. We're in a very different environment than we were in 2 years ago. Interest rates are super high, prices. So transaction volume is super low because people have locked in interest rates at like 2-3%. They're not getting out of it. And that is causing that. What that's doing is that it's keeping prices elevated and not letting them drop, right? So between the high interest rate and the high prices, if you're looking for a turnkey rental that's going to cash flow, you're lucky if you find something that breaks even in a really good markets. And so our strategy has to shift in these times. And so within our program, we're constantly coaching, people are constantly acquiring. What we're doing is, I look at it as three different things, right? I would say what we're buying is different. We are trying to buy properties at some discount if possible, right? A little bit of discount. So in most markets, prices have reset between 10 to 15% between the peak that we saw last year. And so there is a little bit of discount over there. You want to buy for the long term. This is what we just talked about. And you want to buy something that is cash flowing. That's the most important thing. So being really intentional and then picking the right market. If it's short-term rentals, regulations, you really want to be careful about what you're buying, because it's not a time where you can buy anything and you're going to do well. The next part is going to be, how do you ensure you can hold this property? No one has a crystal ball, and there's a best case scenario, there's an expected reasonable case scenario, and a worst case scenario. I think we should all plan for worst case scenario, because the other two scenarios don't really matter. You're not planning for it, right? And so that can make you feel better, but it's really useless. So in terms of, can you hold a property? This is where I say, use the calculator, stress test all your deals. With short-term rentals, we're dropping revenue. We're dropping the average daily rates by 10%. We're dropping occupancy by 10% and seeing if those numbers still make sense, because you don't want to be feeding these properties. With long-term rentals, drop your rents by 10% and see if you can sustain it. Will that happen? It may not happen. We may have a soft landing. That's more likely just with the way things are. But we are always planning for worst case scenario, right? And the final part is what I like to talk to investors about. So we don't have control over what market prices are going to do, right? That's something that's completely out of our control, but that's just one factor of real estate investing. So if you can find ways to increase your cash flow, for some people that is doing midterm rentals taking a single. We have members in our community who take a single family home for $400,000 that they could rent for $2,500 as a long-term rental, and they furnish it and they rent it out for $7,500 to $10,000. right, as a midterm rental. And so they're tripling their cash flow with that strategy. And it's not as time intensive as short-term rentals. There are others who will buy a short-term rental and get, higher returns by doing that. So small
It's
shifts in
midterm like 6 days to six. What is the definition of
1
midterm?
month, 1 to 6 months typically. So
Okay.
if it's less than a month, it's still considered technically a short-term rental. By the IRS, there are different rules. We can get into it if you need to. But anyway, anything more than a month is typically midterm rental. And then you can go in and rehab something, right? Find something which a first-time home buyer, like I got a property a few years ago where I got it for $360,000. First-time home buyer wouldn't touch it because the carpets needed to be changed. The appliances were all shot. I went and I put in 15 grand. That's it. Completely redid the whole place, got countertops changed. So it was only 15 grand and the property value went up by $100,000, right? So those are the strategies that you can do where you need to be a little creative, think outside the box, and then tapping into those tax savings, right? That's something, doesn't matter what the market does in terms of pricing, as long as it's based on what you acquired the property for. If you're tapping into that, that gives you a buffer, right? So you have all these other additional things that you can do, where I think it's a time where if you're willing to buy long-term rentals and have it break even and write it out and then refinance when rates go down, that's probably the only way you can get turnkey rentals. You could try different markets. Some markets tend to cash flow better. So hybrid markets tend to do better in terms of cash flow. The Midwest tends to do better in terms of cash flow. So for someone for whom cash flow is really important, you may try different markets, or you shift your strategy and then you tap into additional savings. So that's what I usually like to say. Okay, be intentional about those three key components. What are you buying? How can you hold this property, and still have it sustain itself, and then control the things that you can control, because there's so many things you can. As long as you have a longer term strategy, prices will reset. And like I said, revenue doesn't really drop as much. And so all you're doing with your stress testing is factoring in the 10% drop that typically happens during recessionary periods.
Yeah, good stuff. Cool. Well, where can people find you? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about your community.
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. We have grown. We have a community of about 10,000 physicians. It's Generational Wealth MD. We're online. I love educating. I love speaking about this. We have a free Facebook group, and then we're on all the social media platforms. And on our website, we have tons of resources. The financial independence worksheet and retirement calculator I was talking about is in the resources section. Calculators for long-term and short-term rental for anyone trying to purchase something now. Just, if you want to stress test, use those calculators. Those are available. I have a free ebook where I talk about how I did it. So kind of like an overview of how you can think about real estate and how to educate yourself, how you can do due diligence. But we also host 2 free live events every year. It's a 3-day live event. It's 9 hours of coaching, where I feel like every time I do a podcast, it's like piecemeal. This is like start to finish. Okay, this is what are your goals? This is the kind of investor you are. So how do you pick your strategy? How do you pick your market? And then I want you to, educate yourself about these things in terms of building a team and taxes and accounting and all of those things. So we go over that in a more systematic fashion so people can really come up with a plan. And it's usually, so we have the next one coming up in September. It's generationalwealthmd.com/event, all lowercase. And I think that's a great way for people to get into the community, be supported on their journey, but also have like a systematic way of doing it, I feel.
Yeah, that's good stuff. We'll link to all those resources in the show notes in case you're interested. You can check those out. So yeah, I like where you're going with those things. And that's the key, is you're getting some good education out there. And that's what we really need to be starting with this stuff. So Param, I really appreciate you coming on. It's been a fun conversation. And I know there's a ton more we need to talk about. So maybe we'll have to circle back at some point. But thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. It's so much fun, Daniel. Thank you for what you do. I think this is so important, talking about all things finances, all the questions that you pose, all the topics you talk about. I really love listening to your podcast.
Thanks.